The New York State Office of Addiction Services and Support, or OASAS, provides this podcast as a public service. Thoughts and opinions expressed do not necessarily represent or reflect those of the agency or state. This is Addiction, the Next Step.
Hello once again, everybody. This is Jerry Gretzinger, your host for Addiction, the Next Step, brought to you by the New York State Office of Addiction Services and Supports. And today, we're going to be doing something that we try to do as often as we can, and we're going to be sharing a personal story of someone who has lived. It's a real lived experience with substance use, not just themselves, but family members, and they've seen the impacts of it. And, we try to have people share these stories because we know how important it can be for others to hear them and to learn from them. And that is indeed why they share these stories. The person sharing their story today is Nanette Matthews. She's a mom who lost her son, Antoine Brewster, to an overdose in 2020. And Nanette, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
So, I want to start by saying we applaud you and others like you who come forward and have a story to share and say, I want to share this because you know the good that it can do. So let's just get right into it. Talk to me about your son, first of all. I know that's the reason that we got together, and in 2020, this horrible thing happened. Kind of walk us up to that date. Who was he? What was his situation? How did he get there?
My son, Antoine Brewster, was 43 years old when he passed. He had struggled with substance abuse for several years, and he had been in and out of treatment. So by the time he passed in New York, but he had been living in North Carolina up until the day before he passed. And he had been in treatment, I believe, and he had been in and out of jails and institutions, and he really struggled, but he wanted to be clean. He had seen me go through similar situations, and he knew that recovery was possible. And for whatever reason, he decided to come to New York in the middle of COVID, mind you. It was in May, right after the pandemic had been declared in New York. And his aunt had passed away. And
so he was in New York for her for a funeral or a...
He was in New York for a funeral.
I see.
And in New York, and he was in New York less than 24 hours before he was dead. Up until that time, he had been a chef. He had children. He had been married. He had been separated from his wife, and he had a lot of ups and downs. And but he was a really loving person, and I know everybody says that, but he was. He didn't have any violent offenses as far as I knew.
Yeah. And
he really, really struggled with this disease. And I know people almost, shrug their shoulders when you tell them about somebody dying from an opioid overdose.
Yeah.
As if, that person either didn't matter or they were somehow bad.
Yeah, Nanette, it's interesting you mentioned that because that's one of the things that we hope to address in sharing these stories is that stigma that surrounds it, right? We want to try to tackle that as best we can because it can be so prohibitive to people, getting treatment, reaching out for services. I just want to expand a little bit. I know you said he was in town for a funeral. And correct me if I'm wrong. Was this person who passed also the victim of an overdose?
Yes, it was his father's sister, who had also been addicted almost all of her adult life. And she was she was my sister-in-law, but she was a beautiful person. She was very, very smart, just loving. She had so many friends. People in the community loved her. could always like count on her for different things, and somehow she got addicted to heroin. And the last time I saw her, she was very, very, whatever she had in her system was causing her to nod off. And I used to go check on her. I had known her since she was a little girl. And when it was finally time for us to separate, I dropped her off at her house. She cried. She didn't want me to leave. And, you know, I didn't ever think that that would be the last time I saw her. Yeah. But I tried to get her to come live with me. She was living in New York, and I was living upstate at the time. And I could never get her to give up whatever it was that she was holding on to that she felt was most important. She just couldn't let go. And she passed away in April, and my son came up for the funeral, and he passed away in May.
Wow. So it was his father's sister, who that was, you said, right?
Yes.
His aunt. And then he comes up, he has an overdose the next day, he passes. You had mentioned that you have a similar history where you had some struggles, but you were able to kind of get, you said, to recovery, that recovery is possible. And,
right.
and I know you referenced that your son has children, so you have grandchildren.
Yes.
And you said from in North Carolina, is that correct?
Yes. And
I know sometimes, as horrible as it is, there is sort of addiction can be hereditary almost. People, are prone to something like that. How are his children doing? And hopefully, they've also seen that, recovery is possible, or that they've learned, through others' experiences. How are they?
She's, I think, 24. She is she attends UNC. She's in a pre-med program. She's taking her MCATs in January. He has a younger daughter whose life hasn't been very stable, and she was just developing a relationship with my son, where she was beginning to be able to rely on him, and she would call him, and he would go visit her. And I had her in New York with me for a while, but it didn't work out, so she went back to North Carolina to live, and she's doing okay. I haven't spoken to her in a while.
Yeah.
And he also has two sons that we just reconnected with today. My daughter sent me a Facebook post showing me that she said the younger one is a barber, and then he has another one who plays football. So I haven't seen them in years since they were children. Yeah. So I told her that I would love to speak with them and, establish a relationship with them. But you're right. This is almost a family illness, and I learned that in treatment. So I've been very, very adamant about helping the children in my family understand the history of substance abuse in the family, because his father also died of an overdose.
Oh, his wow.
When his father, the brother of the aunt that had just passed also. So, yeah. And as the entire community that I grew up in, many, many, many people have died or are addicted to some sort of substance, whether it's alcohol, heroin, pills. So
yeah, and so much more dangerous now too, with the presence of fentanyl, and so much that people don't even know it's there. I mean, if they have been a recreational substance user, fentanyl could be in it, and that could end their life the first time it finds its way into their system. It is such an unsafe place to be because of that reason, and for so many other reasons. But Nanette, I wanted to get back to you. Had said that during the pandemic, when that hit, your son had been trying to turn things around, to kind of come off of using substances and start living a life without it. But that just like for so many others, the pandemic hit, and it made it so difficult for them to continue that journey that they want.
Right. He was in treatment, and the protocol had changed. Generally, he would go into his probation officer, and they would sit and talk. And I think he had outpatient treatment. But once the pandemic hit, they stopped the treatment, and his probation officer would come out to the house to visit, and they would see each other, and she would say hi from the car and ask him how was he doing, and I guess he would say he was doing okay, but he wasn't working at the time. Yeah. His job had shut down, and all of his contacts that he would visit, like my daughter, who has a family, who lives a normal life, he couldn't reach out to her because everybody was afraid of this illness, the COVID, and all of his contacts, his supports, everybody just shut down at the same time.
There were so many factors, so many additional factors that came up that were working against him and against so many others at the time.
Right.
Yeah. So I want to ask you this too. So we hear these stories, and we hear about people who have used substances, who make every effort to stop using substances or reduce the amount of the substances they're using. And in this case, it was the pandemic that became, a challenge that turned out to be insurmountable. But right. the grip that substances can have on people, it is so significant. And I think sometimes people who aren't aware of that, they don't completely understand. So we would look at a story like this, and I know you talked about, we talked about how families sometimes are prone, heredity, they're prone to addiction. And some people say, well, didn't we anticipate this sort of an outcome, right? How do you explain to people, you know what, this is a human being who, despite their struggles and their efforts to overcome, deserved every right to go through treatment and to find recovery. Again, I guess I'm asking you to address that stigma that sometimes people have.
I don't know. It's been really, 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 really difficult. And that's one of the things that I since have joined my community advisory board, and I'm always advocating for treatment and for people to kind of open their minds and try to understand that substance abuse disorder is a mental illness, and it's a disease. It's an illness. And just like we have empathy or sympathy for people who suffer with suicidality, we may not understand it, but we're a little more open-minded when it comes to things like suicide. And we try to set up protections for them. In many ways, I think substance use disorder, because most people, right now, there could be fentanyl in anything. And for a person to disregard that and still use, there must be something driving that person to use the substance despite all of those health outcomes. That anything could happen. So
yeah, and
I think it's
go ahead.
Really trying to put yourself in that person's shoes and try to understand that it's an illness, it's a mental illness, and somehow we can try to be a little more understanding and open-minded and try to help and be supportive to try to understand what this illness is about and try to do a little more.
You're absolutely
because
right.
Many people are closed-minded.
Yep. And it is a literal disease. Addiction is a disease, and there are treatments, and recovery is indeed possible. As you said, you're living proof of that. And congratulations, by the way, on living that recovery journey. And I will say to people too, behind all these stories, there are families. There's a mom like yourself who has worked and tried to support the loved ones, and unfortunately, sometimes this is the result. But again, we applaud you for going out there and sharing the story so that others hear it. to break down that stigma. And I'll say this too. It is, you mentioned his daughter who's in a pre-med program at Chapel Hill. And, you know, you continue to put the good out there, trying to, you know, steer in the right direction, and hopefully she'll continue on that journey. And, you know, we talked about that cycle sometimes, that heredity of addiction, and, you know, perhaps that's the generation that breaks the cycle too.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Nanette, I want to thank you, and I want to thank others who are out there sharing their stories. We're always looking for people to share their personal stories here, because I think sometimes that's what it takes. You want to touch people to let them know these aren't just numbers, these aren't just stories, these are real people, real lives, and hopefully it will all come together and make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And if people do want to find out more information about the Office of Addiction Services and the supports that we have, you can go to our website. It's oasas.ny.gov. And, you know, go online, check us out. We're also on social media. You can find us there. And again, if you have a story that you'd like to share, go on that website, oasas.ny.gov. Send us a message. Send us a message on social, because we want to share your story too. The more stories we share, the more lives we can change. Nanette, thank you once again for joining us. I'm Jerry Gretzinger, your host of Addiction, The Next Step, and we'll look forward to talking to you again next time.